Indian missions and diplomats have been targeted by Khalistan supporters over the last few weeks. From Toronto to London to San Francisco, Indian consulates have been vandalized and set on fire. Now, posters have emerged in Toronto, San Francisco, and in parts of the UK threatening Indian diplomats. The Indian government has sent out a strong message today, making it clear that such threats and forms of extremism would not be tolerated. Canada, in particular, is in the crosshairs. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau found himself defending his soft approach to Khalistan at a press conference and responded by saying they take serious action against terrorism. The Indian side is clearly not impressed.
Prime Minister, we've seen a parade float depict the assassination of Indira Gandhi and posters calling on people to kill India. The Indian government says you're being soft on Sikh extremism because you rely on votes from that community. How can you demonstrate to them that they're wrong?
They are wrong. Canada has always taken extremely seriously violence and threats of violence. We've always taken serious action against terrorism, and we always will. We have an extremely diverse country, and freedom of expression is something that we have, but we will always make sure that we are pushing back against violence and extremism in all its forms.
Look, our sense is that these posters inciting violence against our diplomats and our diplomatic premises abroad are unacceptable, and we condemn them in the strongest terms. With respect to Canada, the matter has been strongly taken up with the Canadian authorities, both in New Delhi and in Ottawa. We have called on the Government of Canada to take all steps to ensure the safety of our diplomats and security of our diplomatic missions in Canada. The issue is not about freedom of expression, but its misuse for advocating violence, for propagating separatism, and for legitimizing terrorism.
Now, while Canada's response has not been as stringent as India has been hoping for, the true test will come on the 8th of July, in 2 days from now, when a so-called freedom rally will be taken out at different locations in Canada, the US and UK. These governments have been asked to ensure the safety of Indian missions and diplomats. While the UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has said any direct attack on Indian diplomats is unacceptable, top White House official Kurt Campbell has echoed the sentiment.
First of all, let me say that these are deeply regrettable events. We take very seriously the safety and security of diplomats that are living in the United States. We have been in close contact with Indian authorities, with local law enforcement. We are trying to take the necessary steps to ensure that Indian diplomatic community feels safe and secure here, and we'll continue with that work going forward.
Now, the resurgence of Khalistani antics targeting India has heated up since June after the death of Hardeep Nijjar, a Khalistani terrorist in Canada. He was shot by armed assailants. Khalistani thugs are blaming Indian agencies for this and now threatening Indian diplomats. The pictures you're seeing are from March this year, when the Indian consulate in San Francisco was targeted and actually that building was set on fire. So this is the kind of antics that are going on. The question really right now is, can these Western nations hide under the guise of freedom of expression? Is this freedom of expression? Are they being insensitive to Indian sentiments on the issue of Khalistan, especially when Indian missions are being attacked? And how should India respond? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Bharat Karnad, strategic affairs expert, Suresh Kumar Goel, former ambassador, joining me on the show. I'm speaking with Maroof Raza, group consulting editor, Times Network as well, and Ramnik Mann, political analyst. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. Ambassador Goel, I'm going to begin with you, since, we're picking up this story from the newspaper of how the Ministry of External Affairs has responded. Now, one way of looking at this is that should India respond so aggressively to what some free radicals are doing? That's one view. The other view is that we have gone hard and we need to go harder. What do you make of the situation?
Tamanna, I can never forget, and I was still in the service at that time, when the news came into India about the top diplomat, the Consul General in Birmingham, who lost his life to one of the terrorist attacks. We have suffered these things before. And the problem is that, I mean, if you listen to Trudeau, there are words, but there is no indication of a strong action against groups acting to promote terrorism, risking the lives of diplomats in Canada on the score at all. And UK. So I think the only satisfaction that I've seen so far, some kind of a thing that in San Francisco, the FBI has begun to take action. They have begun to explore and they have begun to investigate as to who these guys were, who actually burnt our consulate there. So there is one action over there. But frankly speaking, even though I do understand the electoral politics in Canada, where there is a very significant Sikh vote, and Trudeau may be careful enough not to hurt his electoral chances. But the fact is that we are being threatened because of this politics. And we need to know whether Trudeau or people in the UK are going to act against them at all or not. If they don't, I think we have sufficient leverages to also let them know that this thing can hurt both the sides. But the fact is, if they don't act, it is going to hurt. And the problem is that they are not actually doing anything at all. I'm actually saying it for the first time. So far, I've advocated that we should be gentler in the diplomacy. We should try and accommodate. We should try and find a way out. But the way Canada is behaving, like the life of a diplomat doesn't matter to them at all. So I think we need to take tough action now. Time has now come to let them know that it goes both the ways. Tamanna.
You know, what is also, thank you for that explanation, Ambassador Goel, but what we also need to understand is the intensity of this aggression we have seen. If I take the San Francisco incident, then from March, and of course since June, since the killing of and the death of one of the leaders of this movement, and I'm coming to Maroof Raza on this. The kind of response, Maroof, was that expected? Is that expected, or is that pointing to something else? Because the aggression and the widespread coordination in the name of this freedom rally across 3 countries, across all of these cities, is something to take note of.
You see, Tamanna, I draw several inferences by what we are beginning to see on your screens and we are reading about. The first is that there are multiple agencies and bodies that are encouraging such acts of vandalism, whether it is the absence of them being able to find suitable support bases in India. Please remember, in the 70s, it took off in the rural areas in India, in Punjab, which was subsequently crushed with Blue Star and Black Thunder in the 80s. But now they have very little following here, but they seem to be dancing with flags abroad. The second thing is that these elements are being encouraged by affluent members of their clique or group who are in the hope, thinking that if you start this flag-waving movement for freedom, you have a chance of a bigger deal back in India as and when some negotiations take place. That's absolute nonsense. In the 80s, many of these elements that looked for Khalistan were arguing that since Khalistan produces much of India's grain, it has a lot of membership in the armed forces and elsewhere, it has the potential to become an independent state on its own. The world doesn't need their grain. It is only India that can absorb their grain. The third point is that such elements which are being allowed to run free in places like Canada certainly raises questions about the abilities of these countries to basically stick to the commitment of the Vienna Convention, which guarantees the safety of diplomatic bodies and diplomatic institutions like high commissions and consulates. It is one thing to pay lip service by the foreign minister of a country that we will follow all the Vienna Conventions. Another thing is to enforce it with a harsh hand. Now, yes, there is a certain amount of India's domestic politics which is also spilling over into their counter narratives which are coming out from these countries in the United States, San Francisco, in Canada, the Brompton rallies, in the UK. But the bottom line is these countries have to be told, and Mr. Jaishankar has been pretty firm about it, that listen, you can't get your act together. There will be a price for you to pay, because India is not anymore a pushover or a country that you can get what you want in terms of your vote banks there and tend to ignore the sentiments in India. Nobody now in this world would like to play with issues that are sensitive to India and its sovereignty and its national identity. And if Canada doesn't understand that, or if even Britain doesn't understand that and enforce it seriously, there are leverages, as Ambassador Goel has brought out, that we can exercise.
I'm going to talk a bit about those leverages and whether the time to exercise them have come. Do we need to wait and see what happens on the 8th with this rally, etc.? And what are we exactly expecting them to do? What would we have preferred to see them do? But I'm just going to play out Mr. S. Jaishankar, Dr. S. Jaishankar's bite and his statement on what he's been saying on this issue.
देखिए इस पे मैं इतना ही कहूँगा, और मैं पहले भी कह चुका हूँ कि हम हमारे जो पार्टनर देश जो हैं, जैसे कनाडा है, अमेरिका है, यूके है, ऑस्ट्रेलिया है, जहाँ कभी कभी खालिस्तानी एक्टिविटीज़ होती हैं, हमने उनको रिक्वेस्ट की है कि वो उनको खालिस्तानियों को स्पेस न दें, क्योंकि उनकी सोच जो है ये रेडिकल एक्सट्रीमिस्ट विचारधारा जो है वो ना हमारे लिए अच्छा है, ना उनके लिए है, ना हमारे रिश्तों के लिए है। तो ये जो पोस्टर का विषय ये हम जरूर उन सरकारों से उठाएंगे। हो सकता है कि हम अभी तक, क्योंकि ये कल परसों ही निकला था, हो सकता है कि अभी तक हो भी।
All right, so that was a statement made by Mr. Jaishankar on Monday. So earlier this week. So all of this has been brewing for a while. Of course, we'll have to wait and see where it goes. Bharat Karnad, your take on the sort of resurgence of this movement that we're seeing. What do you link it to? Do you look at it as part of local politics in Canada? Do you see a larger sinister plot here? How do you see this?
No, basically, I think it is, the periodic ups and downs that happen in the Sikh communities that have these radical elements. And these Sikh communities are basically in the Anglophone countries that you mentioned, the 4 countries. And that's where they have the leeway as well, where they exploit the free speech and human rights and so on. And they're given the freedom to voice their opinions and views. The trouble here is these guys often go beyond words and slogans into actually doing harm to the consulate facilities and so on, or embassy facilities, as happened in London the other day. So, there has to be some, I suppose, a tripwire beyond which the Indian government's tolerance is crossed. Insofar as you have the Western values of free speech and so on, that's fine. They can keep it. And if they want Khalistan so much, we should certainly help them carve out a piece of Britain or Canada or Australia. We can help them do it, and they can have a Khalistan there, because there is no space for it here. Because most Punjabi Sikhs simply don't want any such thing. They suffered enormously from the Khalistan movement in the 70s and 80s, and there's absolutely no presence of Khalistan here, and it will not be allowed to take root. And so that's as simple as that. So these are the guys who have a bit of prosperity in these countries abroad, and it's there they sort of with nothing better to do. They get into these kinds of Khalistan and so on, these kinds of causes. Because that's also, by the way, a means of sustaining their own livelihood. Some of them have made, a profession out of it, or being professional Khalistanis, and they extort monies. They are given monies by the Sikh communities, at least some parts of it, and they're sustained that way. So they have to show themselves as being active in those countries, and that's what we see happening. So, I don't think it's it reflects the situation on the ground in India. And but as is asked by our foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, that these countries ought to take it seriously, because one of these days Indian diplomats could get hurt. And the whole thing really spiraled out.
What do we mean when we say they ought to take it seriously? Because I was just looking at about what action has been taken, and in the US the FBI has been put in place. In Canada, the CSIS and their Royal Mounted officials have doubled down on security for diplomats. But what else do we want to see? I'm going to come to Ambassador Goel on this. What would be the sort of right response? Because if we are expecting that these rallies will be called off, I think that's going to be unlikely. Are we expecting that? Is that what we want?
And why not? I mean, you asked me a question. Why can't the governments in those countries compel these people to call the rallies off? My question is very different really here. First of all, under the Vienna Convention, any attack or any damage to the Indian embassies, Indian consulates, any diplomatic property in the countries is considered as an attack on the sovereignty of the country. To the extent that the police cannot even enter the diplomatic premises without the permission of the government concerned. It's a sovereign property of India. And therefore, any attack would be taken as an attack on India, number one. Number two, just consider it. If today Indian protesters were to march to either the Canadian High Commission in Delhi or the US mission or the UK mission in Delhi, and they were to basically just march over there, not even damage the property, not even issue the threat to the property. If they were to march there, what would be their reaction? I've simply put this question because they have begun to take our concerns very, very lightly. And I think they need to understand that it is not only a question of threat to the life and property of a diplomatic entity, but that it is actually an attack on the sovereignty of India. I think I've said enough.
I'm going to come to Ramnik Mann, and Bharat Karnad made that point that domestically, politically, this movement has just fizzled out. It has no real space in today's Indian political landscape. Yet, Mr. Mann, why does it seem like it's growing strongly? Is there some latent support in the diaspora?
Oh, well, Tamanna, it never had any support in India. It never had. And it's evident from the fact that even the top leadership of the separatist movement across the world have accepted the fact that there has been nobody who has demanded Khalistan on the Indian soil ever before Amritpal did. Now that he's been packed away in Assam, these Khalistanis are frustrated. But you also need to understand that diplomacy is purely based on reciprocity. The kind of treatment meted out to Indian diplomats in the host countries, they should expect the same treatment, at least as far as the diplomatic circles are concerned. They have a rule of reciprocity. When you are having, these Khalistanis challenge Ambassador Taranjeet Sandhu in the US with TV Nagendra Prasad, and then Sanjay Kumar Yadav with Apurva Shrivastava in Canada, and in Australia, Manpreet Vora and Dr. Sushil Kumar. You also need to understand that these Khalistanis who are making these threats are not Indian citizens or NRIs. These are foreign citizens. These are Canadian citizens,
Right.
British citizens,
Yes.
or they are
Yes.
American citizens. Now, these host countries need to first rein in their own citizens from raising voice against India or sovereignty of India, like Ambassador Gupta just said, that it's an attack on Indian sovereignty when they attack a diplomatic complex or a diplomatic premises, or when they, when they mean harm, or when they are terrorizing, or they wish to declare Indian diplomats as killers in certain countries. It is their citizen. It is not Indian citizens. So talking about what support Khalistanis have in India, they have none. They have zero. So what popular support they have across the Indian Sikh diaspora in host nations, it's minimal. But you also need to understand that these people have been trying to extract a reaction out of the Indian state, out of the Indian majority community, and these host countries have been seen wanting. How I look at it is that they want India to remain in a jelly state. These Western countries also wish to deny India its legitimate place in the global platform. They want to deny India its position that it deserves. So
is that the case, though? I mean, we've just seen a very successful. 1 minute, Mr. Mann. Is that truly the case? Because we've just seen a very successful trip to the United States being concluded. We have seen India, with a seat at the table at all the key groupings. We are hosting the G20. So I don't know if this is some big conspiracy against India, or is it not being sensitive to what a big deal this is for us? The latter seems to be the case.
Tamanna, you need to look at it from a... Tamanna, you need to see it from the perspective of how, these host nations are reacting to these violent acts of crime. There is a circumstantial evidence attached to what you see is one thing in diplomatic circles, but circumstantially you see the Canadian RCMP has done nothing about it.
Okay, let me come to Maroof on this point. Let me come to Maroof on this point. This is a question I asked earlier. So when we say we want to see more stringent action, what exactly are we talking about?
You see, Tamanna, all distinguished guests have made very interesting points, and all of them are very relevant. Many of the points are being repeated by some of us also. But the fact of the matter is that I think the Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has to go beyond making one or two remarks just in front of a few journalists, but a very clear set of demarches have to be issued to these governments to say India will not tolerate any threat to the lives or property of Indian diplomats or diplomatic missions. Secondly, there will be, and this has to be made very clearly made public to them, there will be consequences. Mr. Mann made a very important point. It's all about quid pro quo. And do you remember some years ago, there was a young Indian lady diplomat who was harassed in the United States. Overnight, the Indian authorities in Delhi removed all the barricades around the US embassy. By the way, US embassy, not the embassy of some tin pot dictatorship in Delhi, and made it known that don't mess with us. She may be a young diplomat, but she represents the Indian flag. And that is what needs to be, again, drummed home. I mean, these countries, freedom of expression, I mean, by any sane standards, doesn't allow you to burn effigies, to show acts of violence and issue threats of terror against diplomats and their colleagues and families. I mean, that's not freedom of expression. We are stretching the point a bit far. I think it should be made very clear. And these countries, let me tell you, have very tough laws if they decide to implement them. The fact of the matter is, they have to be made known to them that there will be consequences. And once the United States says that to some country, I remember in all these years that I've looked at the subject, even Moscow and China responds to the word consequences. What are your consequences? Have you spelt it out? Would you like to go public with the consequences? Would you like to ensure that the police forces don't stand like spectators, as we are seeing on your screen right now, and allowing all this hoodlum and vandalism to happen?
Okay. So we have to wait and see what happens on the 8th. We have to wait and see what happens on the 8th when these marches take place. The security for diplomats should be upped, and the message from India has gone out publicly loud and clear. I'm sure it is also being conveyed in a very strong manner. I have to wrap up this conversation, but we will be tracking the story. I'm taking a short break, but after the break, I speak with exclusively with a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee. He's a DMK MP in the Rajya Sabha, P. Wilson, and he's recently written a letter to the Law Commission on the matter of the Uniform Civil Code. He is representing a group of opposition leaders who are very concerned about the UCC. What are those concerns? I'm talking to him when we return after this break.